Whether you call it kveik, kvik, or kvike, there's no denying that this unique Norwegian yeast has had a remarkable impact on the brewing scene, and Imperial Yeast's A43 Loki is one of the best versions out there. With the ability to produce a clean beer when fermented as warm as 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, you heard that right, while also performing well at more standard ale temperatures, Imperial Yeast A43 Loki is as versatile as it gets, meaning you have zero excuses for failing to brew throughout the year. Learn more about A43 Loki at imperialyeast.com and grab a pouch for your next batch to see what all the fuss is about. There's just something about the complexity of a good sour beer that's both refreshing and fulfilling. While traditionalists will tell you that the best sour beers take time, sometimes upwards of a year or more, modern brewers have developed methods to hasten the souring process, one of which is called kettle souring. Now, while many prefer to seal the vessel during the souring process to keep oxygen out, others claim that souring in an open container can yield positive results. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to chat about kettle souring in open vessels is Cade Jobe.
Yeah, sours are something that I've really come to love drinking, and I think that was likely spurred by the fact that I worked at a sour brewery. But you know, it's that combination of acidity that sort of balances the sweetness of the beer. And I always kind of likened it to adding like lemon to salmon. But kettle sours are becoming really popular, and there are a whole number of ways to produce like really good sour beer. And so, yeah, in this episode, we're going to talk about, open souring or open fermentation, where the sour piece of the step is open to air. And yeah, I think it's going to be a fun one.
Yeah, when I first heard of the idea of kettle souring, and I know other people are starting to use different terms for that, is in essence what we're talking about is quick souring. I was pretty skeptical, and I know that there's a lot of people out there who absolutely swear against doing kettle souring and that you have to go the traditional, long-term route. But then as I started drinking and really enjoying beers made this way, I really did become a huge fan of it. I've brewed many kettle sour beers over the years, though I've always done my souring in sealed vessels. I guess that's just kind of something that stuck with me from normal beer brewing. Should I have kept the vessel open? That's exactly what we're going to be chatting about in this episode, as well as the results of an experiment we did on the subject. All right, if you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month, Mike Myers from Root Shoot Malting will be taking questions from patrons. Mike is a very passionate brewer. He brews. He's also a maltster. He works for Root Shoot Malting, and he knows his way around the brewery and the malt house. This is going to be a very fun session. To be a part of it, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by June 25th, 2021, as Mike is going to be taking questions that Saturday, June 26th. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. And if you wouldn't mind using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're doing your shopping online, we really would appreciate that as well. Your shopping experience won't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. It's such an easy way to support us. I know it takes a little bit of extra thought to go to that website before you do your shopping, but we really would appreciate it. All right, feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers beautiful stainless gear from fittings, kettles, and fermenters to brew stands and incredibly well-built turnkey systems. Do yourself a favor and head over to brewershardware.com the next time you're in the market for brewing equipment. They are sure to have whatever it is you need, and be sure to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Listener Steven Serp wrote in with some feedback after listening to episode 189, where we talked about CO2 pressurized growlers. He said, I have the 1-gallon U-Keg growler and stumbled across a pretty nifty use for it. When I was trying to get my all-grain system dialed in a few years back, I brewed a beer and ended up with a little over 6 gallons in the fermenter. I decided instead of dumping the remaining gallon or so that I would try force carbonating in the U-Keg. I cranked the PSI all the way for one cartridge, let it sit for a few days, then replaced it with another at serving pressure for the remaining. It worked beautifully. I've done this a few times since, and when brewing kegs for friends, allowing me to keep some for myself.
Nice. Yeah. I've heard of a couple people doing this. I've never actually tried it myself, but that's always kind of what I had heard. It takes about 2 cartridges, one of them to carbonate the beer and then the other one to, keep it at serving temperature or serving pressure, I guess. So the volumes of CO2 in solution. But that's a cool one. That's one I'd like to do an experiment on eventually, is like carbonate in the the sealed pressurized growler versus like forced carbonation and see if there's any difference, because that really could be. I mean, if you think about it too, if you're just wanting to pull off just a little bit to do something with, right? Like pull off a little bit just to add some fruit to or something, then you need like a small keg, right? You don't want to take up a full 5-gallon keg to do a gallon of something. Then that's a perfect opportunity for it. And cool. Thanks for the feedback. I'm glad that worked for somebody.
Yeah, I have this kind of probably irrational fear of things exploding in my face. So I've never considered doing this, but I love the idea. And if it does work, I mean, these pressurized growlers, again, we use the Craftmaster growlers over here at Brulosophy. They're amazing. They're so thick, they're strong, they're sturdy. There's no way one cartridge is going to make it explode. Man, if it works, Steven, then keep doing it. I can see so many uses for this. You know how many people I hear from on a weekly basis that are small batch brewers who brew 1 to 3 gallon batches normally? How cool. It's an investment, but how cool to go and pick up 4 or 5 1-gallon growlers, these pressurized growlers that you can just carbonate right in and then serve right out of. I mean, I think that's an awesome idea. So thank you so much for the feedback, Steven. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brulosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. A few years ago, some brewers decided to combine the lightness of pale lager with the hoppiness of an IPA in a style that is now known as India Pale Lager, or IPL. Listener Adrian Grisouris brewed one up he calls Fat Baby IPL and sent me a bottle to share with my friends.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Jimmy, how you feeling?
I'm feeling good, man. I'm feeling good. But look at this beer. Focus on what we're here for.
This beer has a lot of fizzy bubblies.
It's nice. It's pretty smooth.
Yeah?
It wants to be an IPA, but it's not.
I'm going to take a gatherer's.
Nah, I think it might be.
A yeoman's guess.
Nah, it's not.
It's an IPA.
You know better than me. It's a very light one.
It is, kind of, right?
I like it.
I like it a lot.
I'm going to call it a light IPA.
A light IPA. Bred for its abilities and magic.
What do you think it is?
It's an IPA, of course.
Oh, of course, really.
You almost can't taste that IPA.
It's got no aftertaste. It has the smell of it.
Whether we get it right or not, I would drink the hell out of this.
I do like it. It's good.
We're going to invent a new thing. It's called the Jersey Tim PA. The JTPA. This is the first inaugural JTPA.
Nice.
This is a good JTPA. In fact, the label needs to say Jersey and Tim PA.
I got a little juniper with this one too.
It means you're going back to your roots.
It's very good. All right, what do you give it?
18 million thousand juniper berries.
For a total of 12 Jersey and Tims.
First off, I love that the guys enjoyed this beer as much as they did, and their description was actually pretty spot on, a light IPA. And I rather enjoyed Adrian's Fat Baby IPL myself. I've had a few commercial and homebrewed examples over the years, and I'd have to say that this one was up there with some of the best of them. Nicely done, Adrian.
Yeah, it's funny. Another description that they use in there, a lot of fizzy bubblies. So it kind of sounds like a euphemism for something. Like I don't know if we really like this beer. It's just got a lot of fizzy bubblies in it. But no, I love IPLs. There was a brewery in Austin called Last Stand that did one that was right around the corner from us, from where I lived. And that was a fantastic, fantastic beer. And I mean, you and me are both about, crushable beers. And I honestly think I prefer IPLs over to like the traditional hoppy IPAs. And I don't know, there's just something about that cleanliness, that crispness that is just really good. And you still get all that hoppy aroma, flavor, goodness. But, I think it just works.
Yeah. I don't disagree. It took me a minute when I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago, and I was in the Bay Area here in California, where you have access to all kinds of beers. Back then, at least, you couldn't get here in Fresno. And I went into this beer store and I saw this. I think it was Firestone Walker made like a one-off IPL. And I just thought, what in the world? Why just call it an IPA? It's a hoppy beer, Well, it was fermented with a lager yeast, so you can officially call it a lager, I guess. And hey, I've come to really enjoy them. They're nice, they're light, they're crisp. Easy to drink. And Adrian's Fat Baby IPL was money. So again, thank you, Adrian. If you would like to have a beer that you made or any other fermented beverage that you made reviewed on the show, you can email me, Marshall@brulosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. We'll be right back after this short break. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. I have to imagine the experience is ubiquitous among brewers. After racking wort to a fermentation vessel, you pitch the yeast, then wait for what feels like forever until the first signs of life start to appear. As the krausen develops, you rest easy knowing the yeast is turning the sugary wort you made into a tasty beer. Before we get into the specifics of open fermentation as it pertains to kettle sours, let's spend a minute going over fermentation in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people who are listening to this podcast understand that yeast is a living organism, right? It's alive,
right.
And its whole purpose, at least in beer, is to convert sugars in wort, which is primarily maltose, but there are a couple others: glucose, fructose, maltotriose, and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. And it's kind of interesting, right? So the basics of fermentation, at least for alcohol fermentation, is maltose is broken down and turned into glucose by an enzyme that the yeast secretes. It goes through this process called glycolysis, which eventually turns the sugar into pyruvate. And then pyruvate is really where alcoholic fermentation starts. So if you're looking at it from like a biochemical perspective, pyruvate gets turned into acetaldehyde, and then acetaldehyde gets turned into ethanol. So pyruvate, when it gets turned into acetaldehyde, it gives off 2 CO2 molecules. So CO2 is that byproduct right there. And then acetaldehyde obviously gets then reduced into ethanol, which creates your alcohol. So fermentation from a general process is just glucose gives you 2 CO2 and 2 ethanol molecules. And that's really the basics of alcohol fermentation. But there is this other process that happens inside our own bodies, right? Inside yours and mine, human bodies, called lactic acid fermentation. And lactic acid fermentation can occur in a bunch of different ways, but the one that's really important for us today is bacteria and even some fungal species like yeast, like Lachantia thermotolerans, that Philly sour yeast that I did a podcast episode on the Brew Lab. It converts those same sugars into lactic acid. And that's just a direct transfer. So it goes directly from the sugar into lactate or lactic acid. And that creates that sourness, right? So when we're talking about sour beers, this is really to me, this is the main point, and I think I might be a little bit, I think people are going to disagree with me about this, right? Because people are going to say,
welcome to Brulosophy, Cade.
Yeah, right. I mean, people are, especially traditional sour brewers, who are talking about fermenting in barrels for a year or aging your beer and letting it do that. There's more to it than just lactic acid fermentation. But for me, when I'm talking about sour beer, I'm talking about the acidity that is added by bacteria and stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about the Brett funkiness and some of those other things that come from barrel aging. It's that sourness that gets added, and that's where it happens. It happens in lactic acid fermentation, and that's so the bacteria will eat the same sugars that the yeast is eating to produce alcohol, but that bacteria does it a lot slower. And so this is sort of an issue whenever you're doing a sour beer. If you pitch yeast at the same time as bacteria, that yeast is going to chew through those sugars real fast. Now, the bacteria can still work on the residual sugars and eventually produce lactic acid, but that's what takes longer. So what we're talking about today, kettle souring, is what flips it on its head. What if we let the bacteria do its thing first,
Right,
and then we put the yeast in, and then we don't have to wait a year, right?
Yeah, and so I'm relatively newbie when it comes to sour beers in general, and by that I mean I've only been drinking them for the past decade or so. I remember the first time I heard about sour beer, and it sounded like a bad word. I mean, why would anybody want to drink a beer that is intentionally spoiled? Is how I thought of it. Come to find out, there are absolutely amazing sour beers out there. There are some pretty gnarly ones as well, don't get me wrong, but the brewery in Russian River, probably two of my favorite breweries in general, who are making sour beers here in America. Obviously, you've got all of the Belgian sour breweries and stuff, and they're just producing these phenomenally complex, funky / tart beers that are amazing. The thought of not taking a year and a half plus to make one, at first for me seemed like, oh, these people are just trying to cheat, right? And there was this feeling that I had of God, we're willing to cut so many corners to pump out, a product. I have had sour beers that are made quickly. I try to stay away from the term kettle souring, but I understand that has become the kind of the norm these days. But I've had these kettle sour beers from legit breweries that are phenomenal. I mean, at least as good as some of the stuff that took 2 years to make. And so I'm a converted kettle sour in my head. I really appreciate the complexity that you can get from a good kettle sour beer.
Yeah, for sure. For me too, and I mean, again, this is kind of what goes back to me, and you'll hear me say it a couple times through this episode. It's what are you trying to get from the sour beer, right? Are you trying to recreate a lambic, right? Or a goose, I don't know how to say it. But are you trying to recreate those beers? Because those beers, yeah, they really, really benefit from that aging character. And so if that's what you're going for, doing a quick sour is probably not the best option for you. Right. Because it's going to taste different. But what are you doing in the souring process? And to me, that's where I'm talking about, kettle souring or quick souring, is it's playing with acidity. So yeah, we have like the 5 flavors that we can taste in our mouth. That's sour, salty, sweet, bitter, and umami, right? We have all 5 of those flavors. Now, umami is kind of a weird one for beer, although there are mushrooms out there, mushroom beers out there, which some people enjoy. I don't know that I've ever had a good one. Yeah, sour, salty, sweet, and bitter, right? Sweet, salty, and bitter are things that are in every single beer. Now, salt doesn't necessarily mean like table salt, right? Although it can. Goza's, the actual Goza, like the German salted sour beer, actually has salt in it, but your mineral addition is salty, right? So you've got sweet, you've got bitter, and you've got salt from your mineral additions in your water profile. What about sour? And why isn't sour a part of that conversation? Because you can add acidity to things and it really blossoms. Like I said at the top of the show, if you add a little bit of lemon to salmon, that salmon just takes a whole new level.
Yeah.
Or, think about whenever you're cooking, adding acidity to something elevates the entire dish. And so that's kind of what I think about whenever you're brewing with sour, or when you're trying to do sour beers. Now, again, that's not a lambic. That's not an American Coolship Ale. That's not a spontaneously fermented beer that's got Brettanomyces and Pediococcus and all these other sort of things in there that will contribute flavor compounds to it. This is just sour for the sake of sour. It's getting that acidity into beer.
Well, and I think it's safe to say, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Cade, that the sour that you're going to get from kettle souring, from quick souring, however you choose to go about doing that, is going to be largely lactic acid. It's going to be that lactic tart sourness that I think a lot of us are really used to at this point. And, you can add a touch of lactic acid to an IPA even without making it sour, but it really will change the way that beer it presents itself on your palate. There's a common idea that acidity is one of the primary components to making flavors pop, right? And the balance of that acidity. Not to say that it has to be tart, but yeah, I'm with you. Beer, a very important aspect of beer, it must include acidity on some level, right? And so you're not going to get a traditional lambic, you're not going to get a traditional Flemish red ale by using a quick souring method, but you can get a really good version of both of those that just taste a little bit different. And I feel like this is where we move into kind of Brews Views stuff. But hey, I feel like there's this really black or white thinking when it comes to certain brewing methods. Lagers are another one, and the wild and funky sour beer brewing is another one as well, where you're either all in on the traditional approach and everything else is bad, or you do the modern approach and the traditional approach, people are wasting their time. There's room for all of it, babies. That's what I'm saying. Do what you want, man. It works.
We can all love each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. But the other thing about kettle souring too is it gives you a lot of control over what you're trying to do.
Yes.
Because you can vary how you sour the beer, right? I mean, we talk about this all the time in other aspects of brewing, but the environment, where the bacteria is doing its thing has an impact, right? Mm-hmm. on this fermentation, and not just yeast fermentation, but also, not just bacteria fermentation, but also the yeast, right? So temperature, pressure, access to oxygen, alcohol that's actually in solution. Alcohol it's an antiseptic for a reason, right? Yeah. I mean, it kills a lot of bacteria and wild yeast in high enough concentration. So all of these things have an impact. And so it makes a lot of sense, why you'd want to kind of look at, your fermentation practices when you're doing, when you're making a sour beer.
Absolutely. And there are, we're not going to get too deep into souring microbes and how to get your wort sour prior to pitching your yeast. I've used unmilled grain. I've used Good Belly. You can actually buy probiotic pills and use those. You can go and pick up bacteria from the homebrew shop. There's so many different options. Whatever you choose. Typically, what you're going to be doing is holding that wort while it's souring at about 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is I think close to 35 C or so. And then you let it sour down to wherever it tastes good to you, and then you typically you're going to bring that up to a pasteurization temperature just to ensure that bacteria is no longer working, and then cool it back down and you ferment it like normal. Sound about right, Cade?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally. Hold it and the time that you hold it sort of varies, like you said, depending on how sour you want it. And if you just want a touch of sourness, you don't have to hold it for very long.
Right.
But if you want like a nice sour beer, a nice clean, crisp sourness, 18, 24 hours, something like that, it may be all you need, or longer if it's working slower. But that choice of what you add in there is important, right? And
yes.
And I think that's sort of where it plays a role. There's all kinds of sour blends out there, and if you're putting a lactic acid bacteria in with an Acetobacter, a Pediococcus, and a Brettanomyces or something like that, and you're only letting it go for 18 hours, those other things aren't going to have enough time to do anything, and you're certainly going to kill them when you boil
right.
after after getting to your sour.
And that's a really good thing to point out. This is why I made the comment I did earlier about 99% of the acidity that you're going to get from a quick sour beer is going to be your blanket lactic acid. And lactic acid bacteria is what you're going to want to use for your souring, because that's what your aim is. And it's a clean sour, in my opinion. You're not going to get too much funk, but you can, I've had beers where, in fact, House of Pendragon is doing some really incredible stuff in their sour program. Beers that are essentially quick soured, but then pitched with Brett and allowed to, fully ferment out with Brett and a clean Saccharomyces strain. And they're phenomenal. There's a lot of freedom to play around when you're doing these quick sour beers. So it's during this sour step where the variable that we're going to be talking about today comes into play. I remember the very first time I made a kettle sour beer, and I did it in a kettle. So I mashed brew in a bag, removed the grains, and then I actually brought the wort up to pasteurization temp just to make sure. Then I chilled it back down to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and I tossed in a bag of grains. When I did that, when I consulted the internet, the ever wise internet, all the talk was you have to not only keep the lid on, but you want to put like plastic wrap on top of the wort, and then you want to wrap the sides of the lid with plastic wrap to keep all oxygen and bugs out and all of this stuff. It was absolutely, in my mind, essential to keep that wort away from oxygen while it's doing its souring.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there, right? Again, if we're looking for clean sourness and souring in a quick sour method, getting other bugs and stuff into the beer could cause other flavor issues. Now, again, I think it depends on the bug that gets in there. And I'm going to call it bugs just because I think that's kind of generally how it's referred to. I don't mean like these are like nasty things getting in the beer. These are things that people want in their brew. But you know, and that was just like me too. You know, and I think the other piece of this was modern home brewing and modern brewing in general takes place in closed vessels.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
And so I think it makes sense. Why wouldn't you put your beer into a closed vessel? I mean, when you're quick souring, even if you're going to boil it afterwards, I mean, you'd still kind of want to cover it up at least with a lid or a plastic wrap or something like that. And even some people, you know, totally sealing off the vessel because again, this lactic acid fermentation can take place in anaerobic conditions. Now, most lactic acid bacteria will also do fermentation in the presence of oxygen. But again, if you're kind of trying to spur and help the lactic acid do what it wants, it makes a lot of sense that you'd want to control oxygen ingress, that you'd want to control, what other pitches, like what other microbes are getting into the beer. And you have that stuff on hand, right? Like most people, most homebrewers especially, have a kettle with a lid. So it's really easy.
I would hope so.
Yeah. You know, or some way to like close up the vessel a little bit, or, you know, like Jason did in this experiment, you know, actually fermenting in a sealed keg, you know, so it's actually closed to oxygen. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why people might want to do this if you're trying to get that nice, clean, quick sour.
Yeah. I'm by no means an expert when it comes to sour beer brewing. I don't know the science behind bacterial fermentation or anything like that. But what I was told was that by souring with any access to oxygen, I don't want to necessarily say in an open vessel, because I was implored to cover the top of the wort. I feel like it's so stupid nowadays, but to cover this top of the wort with plastic wrap, because that would keep, further reduce the chances that oxygen would touch the wort while during the souring process. What I was told was that something about the souring microbes, the lactic acid bacteria interacting with oxygen and yada yada, will produce butyric acid in some way, or some, isovaleric, cheesy, weird grossness. There's absolutely no way I would ever want that in beer. And back then I just kind of ate it up, hook, line, and sinker. Okay, I'll just cover it up and do it that way. What is it? Do you even know what it is scientifically, about the interaction of oxygen during the souring process that would or even could produce those off flavors?
Yeah, so I did some research into this, and honestly, the science is a little bit above me, but but there's a good, quick and dirty answer, and the quick and dirty answer is that's a myth. Okay, and I think that's sort of general consensus that it doesn't happen that way in practice. If I understand correctly, a while back, let's say probably 10 years ago or so, there was not 10 years ago. There was a study that happened a long time ago, say like 25, 30 years ago, that suggested that in the presence of oxygen, you could get isovaleric or butyric acid from lactic acid bacteria because of some of the other intermediaries that they produce during, while they're doing their stuff, like their normal life cycle. Ultimately, my understanding is that kind of got publicized about 5-10 years ago, right? And people were saying, "Oh, look, this study says that." Well, the study didn't say that. The study said it might, right? Like, here's how it could happen. But since then, a number of people, and I read about this over on Milk the Funk. I mean, I know a number of people over there have looked into it, and it just is just generally not the case. That isovaleric or butyric acid is gonna be produced by this. And I actually asked, I can't remember who the guest was, so you'll have to go back and listen to the Brew Lab episodes to see. But I actually asked one of our guests about it. I think it might have been Farber, Matt Farber, when I did the Philly Sour episode. And asked him about isovaleric acid, and he just said, it's not really going to happen. So keeping your beer closed because of that thing, I feel like we can say with some confidence isn't really an issue. But, getting things into the beer, and this kind of depends, again, like I said, on how you're going to, what you're going to do with the sour beer after. If you're going to boil the beer afterwards, then getting those other bugs in probably isn't going to be an issue. But if you're going to go straight to the fermenter, or if you're doing the lactic acid fermentation first,
right,
and then adding yeast or Brettanomyces or something, if that is open to the air, you do have some exposure that can come in there. And again, this science is definitely above me, but I do want to throw this out there. The bacteria does do different things in the presence of oxygen.
Right.
While it can make lactic acid in the presence of oxygen, it also does a bunch of other things, right? And that's where the science is above me. Those other things could lead to bad or flavors that you don't want, or just not that like nice, clean lactic acid crispness that you're going to get in anaerobic conditions where there's not sort of ample oxygen all around the bacteria.
I recall we all are huge fans of Milk the Funk over here at Brewlosophy. Even those of us who aren't huge sour beer brewers, that they're just a trove of incredibly thoughtful information. Dan Pixley's such a cool guy, and I recall him responding to somebody making a claim about closed souring and how important it is to avoid these off flavors, and him basically saying what you said, that this idea came from basically a hypothesis, no findings, that souring in a again, I don't want to use the word open because it's not like I mean, there are cool ships, and cool ships are completely open. They rely on the bugs in the air a lot of times to sour wort. So there's some argument to be made for practice versus theory, right? I mean, practice has proven that you can make a really good sour beer by souring it in an open vessel. And he pointed that out, and I remember thinking, wow, the guy from Milk the Funk is actually calling out this myth is a strong word, but this kind of potentially false claim. And I think that's interesting. And to this day, I've done probably 3 kettle sours now where I just put the lid on my kettle. I'm lucky enough to have a nice electric kettle that I can just set for 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 35°C or whatever, and walk away for a couple of days until it's tart as I want it to be. And then I just heat it right back up right in that same kettle. I no longer put the plastic wrap over the top of the wort, but I'll admit I do wrap the edges of the kettle still, the lid.
Yeah. I mean, whenever I've only made a kettle sour at home a couple of times, but when I did that, I just throw the lid on the kettle and let it go. Right. I mean, I wasn't really trying to be super careful, because again, there's not a whole lot of time for other things to get in there, and especially whenever I've made my quick sours, I'll generally pitch the lactic acid bacteria right after the mash step, between mash and boil, and then I'll raise it to boil and do my hops and whatever else I'm doing after that, right? Sort of normal brewing process at that point. If you're pitching the stuff and you're doing this open fermentation after the boil, right? Like either before fermentation or after Saccharomyces has done your primary fermentation, then you do have to be a little bit concerned about openness of the fermentation. But I kind of look back at this from like a historical perspective too, right? Like surely the first beers that were ever made, and honestly beers for the last 1,000 years, were fermented in open vessels, because if you closed the vessel, it would explode, right? I mean, I've got to think even barrels, if they're like watertight and such, and you've got CO2 pressure, there's got to have been like exploding barrels or things.
Absolutely.
So open fermentation has happened for a long, long time, and because of that, there are a lot of really cool traditions that still exist, like lambics and like gozes, like cool ship ales that you talked about. I mean, shoot, you look at the California Common steam beer, right? I mean, according to Anchor, it's called steam beer because they let the cool ships, they ran the wort up to the top of their factory so that the ocean air could blow over the top of the beer and cool it down. Surely those beers caught some sort of, lactic acid bacteria or wild yeast or something, that they fermented with. So I think there's a lot of tradition to this too, right? And so people will say, I think both sides, like, oh, if you leave it open to the air, you're trying to do it more lambic. If you close it off, then you're just trying to get this clean kettle sour. And I'm not sure that that's the case, but it does depend on your process.
I'm right there with you. And I will say that in the times that I've kettle soured, the aroma that comes off the souring wort it shifts. It's been different, at least to my memory. Every time I do it, there are times where I'm like, how in the world is this going to be a drinkable beer? And it ends up being phenomenally good. There are some aromas that are created during the souring process at times that are a little suspect. We'll call it that. Well, as a brewer of kettle sour beers, contributor Jason Cipriani was curious about claims he'd heard regarding fermenting them in open vessels or souring them in open vessels and decided to put it to the test. Results when we return. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the brew bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the brew bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a brew bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
I'm a huge fan of sour beer and have had excellent versions made using a number of methods from traditional to kettle souring, and I've made a few beers myself using both of these methods. It never really occurred to me to ferment one in an unsealed vessel, so I was really interested when Jason proposed this experiment.
Yeah, this one was a cool one, and it kind of arose out of that whole isovaleric butyric acid kind of issue and discussion. But it was also just, let's see what happens if you do a sour beer that's open, right? That's open fermented. So it's kind of a cool idea. And yeah, this was Jason's beer, but he did dual 5-gallon batches of a sour blonde ale in the Grainfather units, which I think is just a fantastic. See, that's one of those styles, blonde ale, that just really benefits from a nice touch of acidity.
I love a good sour blonde, dude. So
yeah,
good.
dude. I mean, if you haven't had one of these, trust me, to my mind, that's the best entry point to sours. Is just to try that with just a little touch of sourness. But anyway,
so good.
yeah. So the recipe on this one was fairly nice. Again, sour blonde ale, so it, really easy recipe. So you had 2-row was the primary. It was 91% 2-row, 5% caramel, 10, and then 4% honey malt, which I think was kind of interesting for a blonde ale. But hey, adds a nice little color and a little bit of sweetness, caramel character to balance out that acidity. So then each of the batches was mashed at 155 F, 66 C for 60 minutes. And then when the mashes were complete, he sparged to collect identical volumes of wort, and then boiled each of those for about 15 minutes without hops to pasteurize those before transferring them to sanitized kegs. So pasteurizing is something we didn't talk about in the first segment. Whether you need to pasteurize, bring your wort to a boil after you've done your mash step. To me, it's just added insurance. And since this one was about souring in an open fermentation vessel, let's make sure that we've got we've killed off any of the bugs and stuff that were already in it.
Yeah, you're going for a clean slate. That I do it as a matter of course when I'm making kettle sour beers. As soon as I'm done with the mash, I think you said you don't do it typically. But I do it as a matter of course. I will take the grains out, bring it up to a quick boil, or even just pasteurization temp, about 175 F, and then drop it back, chill it back down to 100 degrees, and then proceed with the souring process.
Yeah, exactly. So Jason just pasteurized the wort boiled it for 15 minutes so that we had a clean slate.
Yeah.
The both worts were at the same OG, which was 1.050, and the initial pHs, although it was a little bit different, wasn't huge. 5.25 in one batch versus 5.31, which is a delta of 0.06. That probably, I don't know exactly for sure about the pH meter. That probably falls just in the range of error on the pH meter.
That's what I think too. Yeah.
Yeah. And since they were treated the same up to this point, it's possible that they were different for whatever reason. But again, a pH of 0.06, pretty close, doing side-by-side batches. So then this is when Jason added Good Belly, which is what you talked about, Marshall. It's a probiotic. And he pitched the same amount of that into each batch so that we can get the souring started off. One keg was sealed with a blow-off tube attached, and the headspace was purged. Plus, he also put gas on the keg so that it was actually blowing gas at a very low pressure while the souring was occurring, just so that you could make sure that there's no oxygen ingress.
Right.
And so one was sealed with CO2 blowing on it. The other one was left open except for a piece of sanitized foil, which was placed loosely over the opening. So this is even, more open than what you and I would do, is just put the lid on a kettle.
Yeah, exactly. This is his whole idea here was the only reason he put the foil on was to keep actual bugs out, because bugs are attracted to sweet stuff. He wanted to keep flies and fruit flies and all that stuff out of his beer. So he just loosely placed a foil over the top of it. The idea being this beer had ample access to oxygen. Oxygen ingress was absolutely going to happen. Now, just a note for those who are unfamiliar with what Good Belly is. It is a probiotic drink that you can go to the grocery store and buy it yourself. That actually tastes really good, I think. Then I believe the most active bacteria in there is Lactobacillus plantarum, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. I think it says that on the label, Lactobacillus plantarum, which is just a variety of lactic acid producing bacteria. So we pitched that, and then after about 24 hours, checked the pHs. The closed pH was 3.66. And the open one was 3.71. So the difference was about 0.05, which was basically the same as the starting difference.
Exactly. So to me, this does kind of, support the idea that maybe there was a very, very small difference in pH in the beginning. What could cause that? Who knows? They were treated exactly the same, but that difference again is very, very small. It's not something I don't think anybody would be able to taste it right off the bat anyways. So.
Yeah, exactly. And you've pitched lactic acid bacteria in here. So, one of the things you would kind of expect to see is that it's going to sort of normalize the pHs once the bacteria is kind of done doing their thing, which actually is what he saw. So after 4 days, he checked the pH again, which 4 days is a long time for a kettle sour, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But he checked it after 4 days, and the closed one was at 3.39, and the open one was at 3.37. So that's a difference of 0.02.
But it's a difference in the opposite direction, which, in my opinion, if we're expecting to see consistency in the pH drop, if there was no difference, between these two batches, you would see the closed one being, 0.05 to 0.06 lower than the open batch. But we didn't see that. The batch that was open to the air actually ended up dropping. Again, it's a tiny, probably imperceptible difference overall, but it ended up dropping a bit more, meaning that it had slightly more acidity to it.
Yeah, just slightly. Again, 0.02 from the pH scale. Now, again, I'll mention it again just to be safe, is that's probably within the error of the pH meter, right?
Yeah.
So all of those readings are probably, within, you might have just had the pH meter read it slightly different than what it was. But again, those numbers are so close that I think that's fine for this experiment. And so
I do have a question though. So do you think that access to oxygen is something that I'm thinking of normal, Saccharomyces cerevisiae fermentation. You oxygenate your wort to add nutrient to the yeast so that it ferments well and it is active. Do you think that maybe access to oxygen actually kind of contributed to those bacteria doing their thing a little bit more in the open batch versus the closed batch, or do you think this is just a function of some other thing?
It's interesting. I'm not really sure because I don't know how, I know how yeast is impacted by oxygen, using it for their cell walls and such. I'm not sure about bacteria. Maybe the process is the same. I really don't know. Yeah, good question. Maybe that's something we should look into or see if there's somebody smarter than us that can tell us.
I'm sure there are.
Yeah, there always is. There always is. So he then took original gravity measurements after souring just to see where they were at, and they did show a slight drop from the specific gravity, 1.050 to 1.043 for the sealed batch and 1.046 for the open batch. Now, this one isn't necessarily as surprising, although it seems like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? How did the specific gravity drop? These lactic acid bacteria, like I said, in the presence of oxygen, they can actually do alcoholic fermentation as well.
Yeah.
So they can consume some of those sugars and actually create alcohol.
It's not crazy. You're not going to get an alcoholic beer, much more than about 1% alcohol max from lactic acid bacteria, but it will do some alcoholic fermentation, and that's what we saw here as well. Again, a moderate difference between the sealed and the open batch. I'm not sure 0.003 SG really matters, but yeah, it was different. And so at this point, though, seeing the difference in pH, seeing the difference in OG, I'm starting to think, man, maybe there is something going on, with the claims that open souring will produce at least, a different beer than closed. I mean, there are, objective differences at least that we observed.
Yeah, for sure. So and it keeps continuing sort of that way from Jason's perspective too. So from there, Jason boiled each batch again. boiled them for 15 minutes to get rid of that lactic acid bacteria, or to pasteurize it, again, to make sure it's not contributing anything later. And then he added 14 grams of willamette to the start of the boil per the recipe. And interestingly, he noted that the wort that was soured in an open vessel had a really unpleasant smell during the boil. He said it actually, I think, made him queasy while he was boiling.
I remember when he was doing this and he was messaging us. He was messaging us saying, "Oh man, there is a gnarly stench coming off of the open soured, beer during the boil." And again, you're like, okay, here we go. It's going to be different, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that stench, I would be worried, especially if I had like open soured a beer, left it essentially open and then it starts to stink during the boil. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see if that stayed. And then after the boil, so he chilled the worts using his counterflow chiller during transfer to carboys, and then pitched each with a starter of Imperial Yeast's GO3 Dieter. He placed the worts in chamber and left them to ferment at 66 Fahrenheit or 19 C for a week before each of the beers reached final gravity, which was in the closed batch 1.012 versus the open batch 1.009.
So same difference in specific gravity there, that 0.003 different from where they started post-souring. So again, now I'm looking saying attenuation is the same for them at least, right? I mean, and a 3-point SG difference really isn't that huge, so.
Yeah, but there's objectively something going on, right? So
Yep.
So I wonder what the difference is. Does it have to do with the bacteria? And I guess it could, right? I mean, there could be a different concentration of bacteria in the good belly, right?
Yeah.
I mean, sure, hopefully it's homogenized, but I guess there could be a different concentration of bacteria that was doing things differently, that just resulted in that initial difference in gravity, even though the attenuation was the same. But anyway, so at this point, both beers were pressure transferred to sanitized kegs and placed in his keezer, where they were burst carbonated and left to condition for a few days before being served to participants. So objectively, before serving this to participants, he looked at the appearance, and you could see from the website, the pictures, these beers looked exactly identical. I don't notice any difference.
They looked exactly the same to me. I guess I wouldn't expect there to be much of a difference, though. It was around the time he was doing this that we were starting to see all of these nasty, purplish, grayish looking New England IPA, and cold side oxidation became a huge focus of ours. So I thought, well, I mean, if you're souring it open, perhaps that oxygen was going to have some sort of an oxidation, effect on the beer. And based on these photos, I mean, that did not happen at all. They looked beautiful and identical, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's that one is kind of surprising, because some of these, especially lactic acid bacteria, but some of the other bugs, quote, that can get into sour are haze causing.
Sure.
So if you got something that smelled terrible during the boil and maybe contributed a different flavor or a different aroma, or there was some different compound in there, that could be haze causing. So to see that they looked the same with no difference in haze or anything else, that's hopefully a good thing if you are interested in open fermenting kettle sours. So Jason's preferences, despite the smell he noticed during the boil and the bias that it produced, he wasn't able to tell the beers apart when doing his own semi-blind triangle test, guessing just 2 out of the 5 correctly. But of course, this was served to participants, and we had in this one 18 participants, which would mean you'd have to have 10 in order for it to be significant. And the results were 3, or only 17%. 3 out of 18 got it right. So that's even fewer than if you just randomly guessed. So tasters could not reliably tell these beers apart.
Neither tasters nor Jason, who was absolutely biased to know what was going on. He knew what was going on with these beers and thought that there was going to be one that had this odd, rancid smell to it. And he said that after the boil and during the fermentation process, it just went away. That part to me is what's most fascinating, because it makes sense that people would come up with this idea. Oh man, when I was souring this wort, it smelled, wretched and terrible, but you boil it, and whatever that stuff is somehow volatilizes off, and you ferment it, and it produces a really good beer. I actually remember Jason messaging the group saying, "Hey, these beers are really good. Nobody is getting it right. I've gotten 18 participants. There's no way, he's like, I just want to drink these beers now." I mean, nobody was getting it. They were identical beers, which, considering the differences that he noted during the souring process and the boil, just is so fascinating to me.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't have a good answer for the explanation too. I mean, a couple of things that were really nice about this experiment was, normally for a quick sour, you just do it for, 18 to 24 hours or something like that. But he didn't get to the pH level that he wanted. So he let it go for 4 days, which I think is longer than a lot of people would do for a kettle sour. So, you smell this different flavor and you think, oh, darn, maybe it did actually get some sort of other, bacteria or some other, fungal species or something that caused a flavor difference. So yeah, and maybe like you said, maybe the access to oxygen, because it's an aerobic bacteria as well as anaerobic, maybe it produced some other compound, right? That you, like you said, volatilized off during the boil and just didn't stick around. Yeah. Makes me wonder what would happen if you had done the opposite. If you just waited until after the boil, pitched your lactic acid bacteria to get where your lactic acid wants to go, and then pitched a Saccharomyces species to finish it off. I wonder how that would affect the open, because that would be more like open fermentation rather than just open souring.
Right, yeah. You commented on how it took 4 days for this wort at least to get soured to Jason's liking. I think he commented on that in the article that for some reason when he uses Goodbelly, it just takes longer than when he uses other sources of lactic acid bacteria. When I've done my kettle sours I like to use unmilled grain because I feel like it does contribute kind of a unique earthy type of sour character to the beer. It takes about 2 days, and that wort, if you're holding it at a nice warm temperature, that wort is pretty tart. It'll drop down to 3.2, 3.3 pH, and it works really well. So the fact it took him 4 days was curious to me. I'm not convinced. I don't know, but I'm not convinced that some other critter got in there and caused those weird smells that Jason talked about. I do wonder if it wasn't some sort of an interaction with the oxygen, and the fact that other people have noticed it. My guess is there's been a lot of kettle sour beers that have gotten dumped before fermentation occurred because people smelled that and thought it would stay in the beer. And the fact that he found in this one that the open and the sealed soured beers were essentially identical, despite the objective differences that we noticed. I think that gives a lot of hope to kettle sour brewers who might smell that weirdness during the boil and hey, don't toss it, ferment it and see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. I think too, when I've done open fermentations in the past, like those smell totally different, right? I mean, like there's banana smells and green apple and all that stuff. It fills up your whole fermenter, and some sulfur too, which is kind of gross as well, that you have when you open ferment versus whenever you're closed fermenting. I don't know if that's just, getting filtered out through the water or sanitizer through the blow off or, what happens there. But yeah, maybe there are just some aroma active compounds that are really volatile, that just come out of solution and don't stick around.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. And in the end, I think the biggest implication here, I kind of hit on it earlier, is that oxygen exposure during souring may not have the impact some people believe it does, at least when you're using, Lactobacillus plantarum. And that's all we can speak to here is that was he pitched Goodbelly. So we cannot say globally that souring in an open vessel is not going to have issues. We only did it with Goodbelly, and maybe we'll get to some other stuff later. But we do have some reader comments I want to get to. The first one comes from Tom Carbaugh, who says, I've switched to the purged and sealed method almost entirely due to the pellicle of the open top method. It's not a huge concern, but the open method creates a pretty gnarly gunk on the surface that I don't get nearly as much of on the sealed version. Oxygen exposure equals pellicle from what I gather. Keeping that stuff out of the finished beer seems to do a lot for the clarity, and nobody likes floaties in their beer.
Yeah, floaties are rough. I mean, especially when you're doing sours. Like I said, those lactic bacteria and some of the other ones, Pediococcus and those things, they do make floaties. And floaties can be like just general beer haze to like actual like stringy, nasty looking things.
Yeah. Snot.
Snot. Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, nobody wants that stuff. That's really interesting that he noticed that the pellicle changed and was different. That makes a lot of sense, especially if you're just totally open, right? If you're just totally open to the air, not with like a sanitized piece of foil, because there are lots of things in the air that are just going to settle down into the beer, which could change the color of the pellicle on top, kind of like dust settling, even though, that's not really what it is. But
yeah, I have to believe Tom is referring to, maybe not necessarily the most traditional of traditional methods here, but it sounds like when I do kettle sours, I don't even get a pellicle. I mean, I'm moving on from the souring process within 2 days. So there's really not much time for a pellicle to form. I have seen bubbles, coming up from the bottom. So, there's some conversion of sugars happening. But yeah, I don't get a pellicle, and I've done both. I've covered it with saran wrap. I've kept it uncovered, and it always just looks the same to me. So, but yeah, you do you, Tom. That's the beauty of brewing, is you get to pick what works best for you. Next comment comes from Greg. He says, any risks of oxidation leaving the wort exposed to oxygen for 24 to 48 hours while souring? If I sour in an unpurged kettle, for example, with just the lid on, or at most some plastic wrap atop the cross of the opening, then the lid on top of that, will the wort oxidize and stale? Great question, Greg.
Yeah, this is a great question. This is honestly one I want to learn some more about. I want to try to do a Brew Lab episode on oxidation and how what reactions happen in beer, which I think would be a fantastic episode.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know that the oxygen is going to do much. I'm not really afraid of hot side oxygen. That's just Cade talking, right? I understand that there are a lot of people out there that do that and have concerns, and that they claim that oxygen sticks around. And there are scientific reactions and processes that confirm that. Okay. But I've never seen an issue with any of the beers that I've brewed, or having had hundreds of other great brews from other home brewers that don't really worry about hot side oxidation.
Yeah.
And so I have to think it's sort of going to be the same thing for the bacteria. Again, that access to oxygen might just cause some additional, compounds to be produced. But again, if you're going to boil it right after that, maybe those compounds volatilize off. So again, in this episode or in this experiment, I think that was a really good example of, hey, maybe we don't have to be worried about that oxygen exposure for open fermentation. And again, I'm fermenting whenever I do a quick sour, I just put the lid on the kettle.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's still sort of the same thing as as a piece of foil on the top.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm not entirely certain that oxygen or oxidation will occur without the presence of both yeast and hops. I mean, you look at what's going on with the New England IPA and how incredibly sensitive those seem to be to oxidation. The biggest difference, I mean, I've made blonde ale before that I rack open into a non-purged keg, and they're delicious. I mean, it doesn't oxidize the way a New England IPA does. It doesn't turn color. I've made standard American clear IPA that oxidizes within a week and turns purple. I really do think it has a lot to do. And people have been looking into this. I think we're starting to get more understanding as to what really is to blame for this oxidation that we've been seeing in these hoppy beers lately. I really do think it has to do with hops, particularly big, heavy dry hop additions, as well as fermented beers. So in the presence of yeast, and that really is where the biggest concern that I have, at least for oxidation, comes in. I don't think you have much to worry about. I think it's a valid question, Greg, because I wondered the same in the beginning. Will that wort stale while it's doing the souring? And I just don't think that's the case. But who knows? Maybe there's some staling going on there. Final comment comes from our friend Michael Tonsmeyer, also known as the Mad Fermentationist and a brewer at Sapwood Cellars. He says, Milk the Funk has a note about Lactobacillus plantarum creating acetic acid in the presence of oxygen. Usually the sorts of objectionable aromas described during the boil from a sour mash are attributed to the microbes other than lacto introduced with the old school handful of grain. My comment on that one for Michael is that I've done the old school handful of grain a number of times. I love that method, and it works really well. It does create some funky smells at times, though.
Yeah, I personally love the handful of grain, right? I should have mentioned this earlier. That's what I've done, is the handful of grain. I don't know that I've ever actually pitched like a lactobacillus blend from the homebrew store. Mm-hmm. I've just done the handful of grain and kept it at 100, 110 Fahrenheit. And that does wonders, but you do get a little bit of funky stuff. Again, and I like that. I like that funkiness, and that grain just, settles out to the bottom or whatever. I assume it's never been an issue. But I like that, and I like that comment as well from Michael, because I do think that highlights that really important point.
Yeah, and if there's anyone who knows sour beer, it's Michael Tonsmeyer. He wrote the book on it. So, but yeah, I like the handful of grain thing. I've had excellent kettle soured beers that do use like lab grown, if you will, lactic acid bacteria. Those are delicious. They tend to be, even the finished beers do, in my experience, tend to be a cleaner lactic sourness, and that works really well with certain styles. But that is all we've got on the impact souring beer in an open vessel has. Are any last words before we wrap this one up, Cade?
No, I think this is good. You don't worry too much about your lid closing and like locking it down tightly or purging with CO2 or something, unless you want to. If that's your thing, then go for it. But yeah, it sounds like these methods will make a nice, clean, sour beer, just like what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. Well, don't forget to check out our new podcast, The Brew Lab, where Cade takes you into the lab with real brewing scientists to discuss fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.